I was invited to make plates for the president of Taiwan, and not just any plates. These plates will be used in Taiwan's most famous hotel in the secret dining room where the president of Taiwan hosts other world leaders. I have just 8 weeks to design, throw, trim, glaze, and deliver 70 plates of the same size and shape, which, if you know anything about pottery, is much easier said than done. It has been my dream since I started making ceramics to create custom dinnerware for a high-end restaurant, but I never expected my first commission to be for heads of state. But not only have I never done anything on this scale, I leave Taiwan in 8 weeks. The most I usually make in a week is 3 to 4 pieces, so I would have to almost triple my pace and hope that nothing goes wrong. Before I start designing, I need to see the hotel and private dining rooms firsthand. The Grand Hotel is Taiwan's first 5-star hotel, established in 1952 by Chiang Kai-shek, and they're revamping their private dining room with a VIP set menu that will only be served in 3 of the hotel's private dining rooms. The first 2 dining rooms are beautiful, elegant rooms that seat 12 to 16, but the final room, with a private salon antechamber, reserved for the president of Taiwan and his honored guests and ambassadors to dine in, is absolutely stunning. After the tour, which I felt so lucky to even be on, I sat down for dinner at the hotel with Andrew, the creative director for the project, who had invited me to join, to discuss the types of pieces we might create. After seeing how grand the rooms are, I knew I wanted a statement piece, something big enough to stand on its own as a dish. I wanted something elegant and original with an understated presence, something that allowed the chef to create art in, complemented by the base that was the dish, not overpowered by it. I had the design of a slightly shallow bowl with a wide, dramatic rim in my head, a design I imagined serving a piece of fish on a bed of vegetables. I couldn't sleep at all the night before I gave it my first go. I was so excited. In the studio the next day, I set to work. This was a bonus week 0, so I had to make some progress to get ahead of my borderline impossible schedule. To make my bowl, I first needed to pull a cylinder with a bowl shape at the bottom, so that I could get the bowl to the right width and depth. Then I needed to flare out the sides so that the rest of the cylinder came down to make the wide rims of my bowl. This design is quite difficult. Larger pieces are always more difficult and more tiring to make, as their larger masses make them harder to wedge, center, and throw. And this design is gravity-defying. I spent all night worrying. Getting these wide rims on it without them collapsing would be hard. Getting them thin enough to be elegant would be borderline impossible. And I wanted a fairly shallow dish, which leaves little room for my hands to fit underneath the rim without distorting the rim to grab the bowl itself. After my first attempt collapsed and then got distorted, I decided to cut it open, for science. The shape looked okay. I was just going to have to be more careful about the sides collapsing. But the next few tries didn't go much better. Even after drying it with a blowtorch, my pieces were too weak and susceptible to falling. Which they did. Repeatedly. By the end of the day, though, I had thrown 6 bowls successfully. Unfortunately, they were all very different sizes, and the sides were much too high. I imagined trying to eat out of them and realized that my elbows would have to reach the sides of my ears to eat out of them successfully. We ended up chucking most of them. I'd lost whatever slim advantage I had. The next week was the real start of the countdown, but it also did not go well. Of the 12 bowls I threw, 6 of them flopped. Sometimes the sides would even remain flat on the wheel, but flop the moment I tried to pick them up. So here I was, trying to get a flat-sided dish and having way more success with flopped ones. It was also very easy to turn the flat ones into flopped ones. So I had to consider, should I pivot? Besides throwing, the other consideration was trimming. This is a chuck. We use these objects, typically made with dried clay, to elevate pieces so that sensitive rims don't sit on the wheelhead directly. Both styles of bowls required using a chuck, as the weight of the bowl could distort the rims of the straight-sided ones, and the flopped ones didn't flop evenly, so trimming without a chuck could lead to uneven bottoms. but using chucks takes significantly more time, and flopped bowls were much more difficult to trim because it was easy to accidentally hit the rims of the bowls as the wheel turned in circles. Not to mention that I hate using chucks. The more I threw these flopped egg bowls though, the more I liked them, and I decided to commit to the flopped bowl design. So I trimmed the 6 of these bowls I had thrown, excited to see these come out of the kiln. After the bisque firing, these were beautiful. I love how they have such an organic shape and movement, and though they're all different, they're clearly part of a set. After the glaze firing, however, it was a different story. I had glaze fired 3 of the flopped version with different glazes to see which glaze I would like the most, but I quickly realized upon seeing them on the table that this was not it. They were organic, unique, and beautiful, but they didn't feel me. They felt like someone else's work somehow, and I knew I couldn't settle. Studying these bowls, I realized that I had spent approximately 2 of my 8 weeks working on a shape that I was not going to be able to use at all. And I had been throwing and trimming way behind pace. There was no way I would hit my target in 6 weeks. But I pushed on. Nothing to do now but make my 70 bowls in 6 weeks instead of 8. The first thing I had to do, however, was to adjust the size of the bowl. My previous dimensions of 4 inches wide and 3 inches deep was too narrow and made the bowl too round. So I redesigned the bowl to be 5 inches wide and 2 inches deep, and the rims 11 inches wide. To do this, I took a pair of chopsticks, cut one to be 5 inches across, then placed it 2 inches from the bottom of the other before securing the two together with a rubber band to make a measuring tool known as a tombo, which means dragonfly in Japanese. By using this tool while throwing, I could gauge the depth and width of my piece while throwing and make my pieces more consistent. Separately, I figured out a way to save my flopped bowls, reducing the total number of bowls I had to throw because I wouldn't have to completely remake the ones that flopped. I found that if I flipped them upside down to let their wings come back down and dry in the correct, flat position, they became the exact shape I wanted. I could even do this with bowls that didn't flop over to make them more flat than they would have been otherwise. Flipping them over had 2 additional benefits. 1, they let the bottoms dry out more overnight, so they were in better condition to trim the next day. And 2, they were flat, so I could trim them directly on the wheel without needing a chuck. These were both major wins. I found that after having thrown approximately 35 of these bowls, though not all of them were the final shape, I was getting better at it. I was botching fewer of them and able to save more and more. There's definitely an ease that comes when throwing repetitively. Your hands begin to move on their own, knowing how wide to cone the clay before making the hole in the center, knowing how wide to open the bowl before pulling up, knowing how tall to pull it before starting to widen the bowl. I found that by this point, when I used my tombo to measure the pieces, I was always pretty close to where I wanted to be. There are also certain steps I had to take for every bowl while I was throwing. In my first few weeks of throwing, I was cleaning up the bottom of my piece where the clay hits the wheel, after I had fully widened out the rim. This was a lot more difficult to do because my tool could hit the rim and warp it, and the rim was already fighting against gravity, so any additional spins were precarious. I found that if I cleaned up this area before I pulled the walls out, not only could I better see what I was doing, it was a lot easier, and any additional clay I could take off in the throwing process meant less time trimming. It felt really amazing to see the progress in my throwing. There were still definitely problems. Some pieces still collapsed and tore, and there was a day when the reclaim clay had lots of sponge bits in it, so I had to stop throwing, because I knew trimming these the next day would be an absolute nightmare. And it was. But maybe I'd be able to make my deadline after all. That is, if I didn't keep accidentally breaking them. By week 5, I was managing to throw 10 bowls a day and trim 10 bowls a day, up from my initial 6-ish bowls a day. The main issue now was just the amount and condition of the clay. Because we reclaim clay in the studio, there is always a steady supply of it when it's been freshly pugged. but sometimes I would get into the studio and our studio manager hadn't come in yet, and there was very little clay left in the bucket. Or the clay would be too hard, and throwing these bowls felt like wrestling and wrangling the clay, often leading to really bad wobbles or pools so uneven it wasn't even worth continuing. If I did succeed in throwing really stiff clay, it took almost 2 times longer than clay the right consistency, which wasn't worth the effort or the strain on my joints. In those cases, I just had to wait and focus on another task for the day. When the clay bucket was full and the clay was just the right consistency though, it felt like there was nothing better. In this process, I also became much more comfortable working with ribs. Previously, I mostly used ribs to clean up pieces, only using them to align the exterior walls when I really needed to. For this project, I was using 2 different ribs for every bowl. The first, more rounded rib went into the bowl to smooth out and define the curve of the bowl itself. The second flattened out the walls to be the bowl's rims. I really had to use these ribs to push out the clay, supporting with my hands but letting the rib do most of the work in actually shaping the clay. My bowls were also starting to look a lot more uniform. It really made me feel like I could do this. Once thrown, my plates each had to be trimmed. I got into a steady rhythm of throwing one day, then trimming the next. The bottoms of bowls always dry the slowest because the clay is thickest there, and they're usually the parts attached to the wear board, so they have the least airflow drying them. When flipped upside down though, the bottoms were exposed to air, helping them dry more quickly overnight, and they were almost always the perfect consistency the next day. This was not always the case, of course, but if I threw enough bowls, I could usually pick out the drier ones to trim first, then work on the less dry ones later, once they had either dried enough, or I could use a heat gun to get it there. The trimming process really pulled all the bowls together and made them go from strange-looking hats to beautiful bowls. Trimming's always my favorite part. My project was definitely taking up a lot of space in the studio. Between my recently thrown plates, which each had to sit on a wear board to dry overnight, and my trimmed ones, which I tried to stack but had to be careful because they are always a bit fragile in this state, I was constantly taking over the entire work table. Sometimes my bowls had to be relegated to the tables outside until classes were finished and the studio assistants could bring them back in to dry overnight. Even after firing, they were taking up loads of space all over the studio. And yes, this studio is definitely a cluttered, eclectic artist space. It was now time to get a move on glazing. I had glazed a few of my earliest pieces to test various colors, but didn't love any of them and settled on aiming for a slightly off-jade color celadon. My studio experiments a lot with glazes, so this would be a bit of an experiment as well. Celadons were originally developed by the ancient Chinese to imitate jade, and I felt that this was appropriate for the setting of the Grand Hotel. So I took my bisque-fired pieces and sanded them down to remove any rough edges before the final firing. After sanding, it's important to make sure no dust is left on the piece before glazing. Some people just wipe down the pieces, but this studio recommends you wash the piece and let it fully dry before applying glaze. If you glaze a piece that's wet, the glaze will not stick to the piece. Glaze is minerals and water, and the water needs to soak into the dry bisqueware for the minerals to stay on properly in the final firing. Glazing these bowls was tricky. We didn't have any tubs in the studio large enough to dunk them in, so I had to glaze them one side at a time, carefully pouring the glaze over the back while rotating the piece. Flipping it, then pouring the glaze into the center and pouring it out in another circular motion. The goal is to get one smooth, even layer of glaze on both the inside and the outside. Too thick and the glaze can run, glob, or react strangely in the kiln. Too thin and the glaze might come out looking like it's barely there. Once I finished pouring, I used my finger and a metal tool to clean up the glaze. I like my glaze to be super smooth, so it's important that any runs be cleaned up or they will often be visible in the final result. The edges in particular had a lot of glaze because they were basically glazed twice as I poured the glaze over the edges while glazing the inside of the bowl. I spent a lot of time cleaning up these parts in particular. You can really see the runs on this second piece. Cleaning up these glaze runs probably took 10 times longer than glazing the bowl itself. Glazing is almost always the trickiest part of the process because you never know the final result until it's out of the kiln, and glazing a piece poorly can ruin your final piece. To get my maker's mark to show once fired, I press this little sponge soaked in water to remove the glaze that's covering the mark. Then I removed glaze from the bowl's feet, then loaded the glaze kiln. Once glaze firing was finished, it was time to check on the pieces. I was really hoping that the pieces would not warp in the kiln, as the kiln gets over 1200 degrees Celsius in this firing, and that the glaze would be well applied. Pulling them out though, I was so pleased. The glaze was beautiful and worked out perfectly. The way that these celadons crack in the reduction firing of our gas kiln is breathtaking. And on some of the plates, the glaze pooled really nicely along the foot and on the inside of the bowl, creating a surface that looks a bit like ice. I couldn't wait to bring these to the Grand Hotel. With 7 days left before leaving the country, I counted up my pieces, and I had finished. Such a relief. The only thing now was the final test, displaying the food in my plates. I packed a few plates to take with us, got in the car, then drove over to the Grand Hotel. As we pulled up, seeing its light illuminate the night sky, my heart was beating hard. I felt such anticipation after spending 8 weeks laboring and crafting and producing my first commissioned work. We re-entered the hotel, this time with plates in tow, and headed up the stairs to the Cantonese dining hall. After we pulled out the plates for dinner service, we got seated and prepared to try the first iteration of the new custom menu. Then the chef came out to greet us and discuss the menu, and the bowls. It turns out he's a Cantonese chef from Hong Kong. When he returned, he brought my plate back with food in it. Wow, I have inspected many dinner plates in my life. I love fine dining, but this was a totally new experience, inspecting and eating off a dinner plate that I had made. This dream I had had since starting ceramics had finally come true, and it felt even better than I thought it would. When the second dish came out, I was over the moon. Never stop chasing your dreams. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.